Good afternoon or morning, depending upon your location. Welcome, kia ora, to this NRCoP National Hybrid Event, Australia's Integrity Landscape, Learning from the Past and Preparing for the Future. I'm Elizabeth Tydd and I have the great pleasure of welcoming guest speakers in just a moment for a really interesting discussion to promote our understanding of integrity in a contemporary environment. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land on which we gather, where we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I further extend my respects and acknowledge the Māori as Tangata Whenua and the Treaty of Waitangi in the Aotearoa, New Zealand, and pay my respects to the Maori who are in attendance today. We have a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators to hear our panel today. And we also have a sizable online audience. We think we have around about 150 registered attendees from New Zealand and from throughout Australia. So before I introduce the panel, there's a few points about the webinar. These webinars are recorded by NRCoP and they're available on our YouTube channel. We'll be using the Q&A function in the Zoom today, so please post your questions there. And we'll be leaving quite an amount of time at the end for those questions, which I'll take online and pose them to our esteemed panellist today. We're also conscious that if you have a question, you can use the facility to upvote that question and it'll come to the top of the questions that I'm able to access. If there are difficulties in you accessing the system, please stay with us and the team will try and assist you. They'll be working in the background on any issues. But if your internet connectivity drops out, the usual story, turn it off and start again. And we hope that rejoining will enable you to participate more. So today in the session, we are focusing on learning from the past and preparing for the future. We're going to be exploring issues largely in government institutions. We'll discuss the state of the integrity landscape and the approaches being adopted within the Australian anti-corruption institutions and how we can ensure that our institutions are best placed to deliver for the Australian community. That's a really interesting aspect of our discussion today, community expectations and the public interest. So now I have the great pleasure of introducing our panellists, and they all have quite extraordinary backgrounds to share. I need to pay them due respect and acknowledge the contribution that each one of them has made to the integrity landscape. So first of all, on my left, I have Professor A.J. Brown. Professor Brown is a Professor of Public Policy and Law in the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University, where he specialises in public integrity, accountability, governance reform and public trust. He's also chair of Transparency International Australia, and that's the World Anti-Corruption Organisation. In 2023, he was made a member of the Order of Australia for services to the law and to public policy, particularly in respect of whistleblower protections. As a 30-year veteran of developments in public integrity systems, he's worked or consulted at all levels and across all branches of government in Australia. AJ has led 7 Australian Research Council projects into public integrity and governance reform since 2005. He currently leads a $1.2 million Australian Research Council discovery project on public trust, mistrust and distrust. Very topical issues in terms of how our democratic institutions function in this environment. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Law. Thank you. Our next panellist is the Honourable Paul Brereton, SC. Commissioner Brereton was educated at the University of Sydney, graduating with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws, and serving 2 terms as President of the Students' Representative Council. He was admitted as a solicitor in New South Wales in 1982 and called to the bar in 1987, appointed senior counsel in 1998. At the bar, he had a diverse general practice, and in 2005 he was appointed a judge of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, where he was assigned primarily to the Equity Division and was a Corporations List Judge and Adoptions List Judge. On the 23rd of August 2018, he was appointed a Judge of Appeal. He retired from his judicial appointments on the 31st of May 2024 in order to assume this significant role and take up the appointment of the inaugural Commissioner of the new National Anti-Corruption Commission from the 1st of July 2023. He's one of the 4 authors of the current and 10th edition of NI's Conflict of Law in Australia. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in the Military Division in 2010 for exceptional services as the Chief of Staff of the 5th Brigade, Assistant Chief of Staff Land Headquarters and Commander 5th Brigade. As an Assistant Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force, he conducted an inquiry into alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. He currently holds honorary appointments as Colonel Commandant of the Royal New South Wales Regiment and the University of New South Wales Regiment. Thank you. Finally, we have Mr. Iain Anderson. Mr. Iain Anderson was appointed as the Commonwealth Ombudsman from the 1st of August 2022 for a 5-year term. As the Commonwealth Ombudsman, Mr. Anderson is also the ACT Now, this is a list, so I'm going to run through this. The ACT, the Defence Force, Immigration, Law Enforcement, Private Health Insurance, Overseas Students, Vet Student Loan, and Postal Industry Ombudsman. There's quite a number of hats there. And that diversity will really add to the rich discussion today. As a senior public servant with extensive leadership experience and over 31 years of service, Mr. Anderson has developed and implemented transformational change across a wide range of legal and social policy areas, including the Commonwealth's civil justice and criminal justice systems, family law, native title, royal commissions, and Australia's territories. Mr. Anderson's experience extends across a variety of Commonwealth departments and agencies and across a wide range of legal and social policy areas. Having appeared over 100 times before parliamentary committees, that almost deserves a round of applause. Mr. Anderson has also represented Australia at the UN Permanent Forum on the Indigenous Affairs and led Australia's delegation to the Financial Action Task Force. Mr. Anderson holds a Bachelor of Economics and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Sydney. Welcome to you all. This discussion will proceed with the consent of my panellists on a relatively informal basis, and I'll be using their first names throughout the discussion today. So now's the time to acknowledge the online audience, let them know that we will be following questions and we'll respond shortly. But I want to commence first of all with an opening question really posed for AJ and invite you to answer questions during the post or to offer questions during the post about what are the burning issues that you see. So we'll collect those questions, and as they move up in order of priority, we'll be able to ask them. Turning back to my question in relation to framing our discussion, you have a unique position. You look at global, national and state trends in respect of integrity institutions. And what does the contemporary landscape in integrity look like to you?
Well, thank you very much, Liz, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you and with Paul and to Iain to try and answer such huge questions, because that is a very, very big question. If you think about what public integrity, and really, as you said, we're really talking here about public integrity and government integrity as the setting, I guess, for what regulatory practice is all about. then if we look at it globally, or if we look at it nationally, it's a very interesting and dynamic landscape. I guess the key thing that I'd say is that we're living in an era where we can't be taking anything for granted. I mean, if we look globally at trends in anti-corruption and integrity and good governance over recent decades, for many decades, especially since the 1990s, there's a fair consensus that we were on a sort of a forward direction of travel that was very consistent with liberal democracies and being healthy and et cetera, et cetera. What we've certainly established in Transparency International over the last 10 years or so is that we live in very interesting, if not dangerous times, in terms of some of the assumptions about what good governance is being very, very much challenged. And we certainly haven't seen the sort of forward progress in public sector corruption being dealt with systematically that many would have predicted from the 1990s and early 2000s on. And Australia and developed countries like Australia are really in a very interesting position, because on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, for example, we've been very much under pressure. Australia has slipped consistently from 85 out of 100 in the wrong direction down to 75 out of 100 over the decade, and we're down to 73 rather, and we've sort of kicked back up again, and we're hoping we're turning around. But I think it's indicative of a lot of people waking up to the fact that many of the things that we just have taken for granted about good governance, in fact, can't be taken for granted. I think we live in a country where and this is where community expectations and public trust really come into it, most citizens in advanced democracies, and including in Australia, expect there to be good systems of governance, expect there to be checks and balances in the system to make sure that power is being exercised properly and that government is doing the right thing, etc. And have been quite shocked when there's evidence that in fact that's not the case. So that's a bit of a global phenomenon, but it's especially relevant to countries like Australia, where I think we've traditionally had very good systems of checks and balances. But we've tended to take it for granted that those systems are there. And then we've had a number of shocks at a Commonwealth government level, the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, but other issues, pork barrelling in elections, misuse of government funds in a whole variety of ways, and then the responses to that exposing gaps and cracks in our integrity systems. So we're at a really interesting time where I think we're in a position where the community expects those checks and balances to be there. We've woken up to the fact that we've been taking them for granted for a long time, that they were there, and identifying that there are gaps in the system. And so the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, other responses to some of our integrity challenges, I think are pointing to the fact that governments are responding and reacting. But I guess what's really interesting about that for us as a country is to be thinking in terms of going back to the fundamentals, I guess, the fundamental principles of what is public integrity. Are we delivering it? It's not just a legalistic process. It's not just compliance. It's are we really delivering integrity? And so many of these controversies, I think, over robo-debt or here in New South Wales, I think people should still be reflecting on the outcome of the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption's investigations in relation to former Premier Gladys Berejiklian. There's lots of questions about, okay, well, really, how strong are our systems and how cognizant are our leaders of the fundamentals, and I mean it, both elected leaders and also appointed leaders of our institutions, about what the fundamentals of integrity are. So I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where there's lots of triggers to not take things for granted, to recognise we need to strengthen systems to stay ahead of the game, and we're really in a process where there's many, many issues that are causing leaders in particular, political leaders, public sector leaders, to really reflect on that. And that's a good thing, but also our answers to those questions are really, really important now so that we don't just slip into back into thinking that, okay, we've created a National Anti-Corruption Commission or done an institutional tweak, problem solved, system fixed.
I'm hearing from your response that perhaps we haven't embedded the learnings of the past to better secure our integrity future. And I'm wondering if I could open both to Paul and to Iain for comments, starting with you, Paul, in terms of what are the key features of our integrity landscape within Australia currently?
I think there's a large discrepancy between the perception and at least held by some corners of the public and the reality. The reality, I think, is that, at least in the Commonwealth public sector, integrity is more prominent as a principle, more at the forefront of decision-making and discussion than it ever has been. It's a hot topic on everyone's agenda. It's at front of mind in most policy discussions. Everyone is talking about it, and most are trying to do it. Some of the contributors to this include the mere creation of the Commission to provide independent assurance to the people of Australia that corrupt conduct involving Commonwealth public officials is prevented, detected, investigated and responded to appropriately. Our mere existence isn't a complete answer, but even our existence causes people to think more carefully and more closely about integrity issues than they might have in the past. A second significant contributor is robo-debt. Its fallout, very widely across the Commonwealth public sector, has been to grow a determination that the behaviour that enabled it not be permitted to recur. A third contributor is the APS reform strategy, in which the leadership of the Australian Public Service has embraced the objective of embedding a pro-integrity culture throughout the service. One important manifestation of that is the amendments to the Public Service Act to enshrine stewardship as an APS value. I do think there is a lot of learning from the past going on in the implementation of responses to robo-debt, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of a general understanding and attitude across the public service that this shouldn't be allowed to recur. When the Commission was about to commence in June last year, I said I didn't believe we were beginning in an environment devoid of integrity, that it was already a strongly espoused value of the APS. If anything, I think over the last 12 months, it has become more so. I also observed that the integrity landscape today in the Commonwealth is quite different from that which Iain Temby encountered when he established the first corruption commission in the country, the New South Wales ICAC, 35 years ago. Since then, there's been a sea change in the tolerance of the public, the press and the public service to corrupt conduct. One result of that is that the corrupt conduct we tend to see nowadays is less flagrant but more insidious than the brown paper bags full of cash of the past. There are three main domains in which we're seeing both the perception and the actuality of corrupt conduct. They're the fields of procurement, of recruitment and promotion, and especially at the interface of the public sector and the private sector. In all those areas, the perceived and actual mechanisms of corruption are typically first the preferring of family, friends and close associates, and secondly the misuse of information to gain an advantage. Those mechanisms produce a subversion of the public decision-making process to serve a private benefit. Almost invariably, they have their origin, like all corruption has, in a conflict of interest between the public interest and the private interest. But it's at that intersection of the public sector and private sector that I think the greatest present vulnerabilities are.
That's incredibly helpful in terms of pointing out priorities and also drawing us to ensure that we're positioned to better deal with the more insidious nature of corruption that you referred to and the threats to integrity, but heartening in that we have seen a cultural shift, and that's incredibly important. Iain, if I can turn to you and ask, how have you addressed these new threats to integrity? How does your office approach threats to integrity that are less obvious than perhaps they may have been a couple of decades ago?
Around about 50 years ago, most Australian states and the Commonwealth created Ombudsman. And looking back across that period, there's been a tremendous amount of learning across public sector agencies about what good administration is and what maladministration is. But the lessons need to be kept at the forefront. Corporate knowledge and corporate memory is really important. Robo-debt was a shocking and sobering exercise in maladministration. It's not the only exercise in maladministration. I mean, we sometimes forget, but you go back a bit further and you see the Department of Immigration and the illegal deportation of Vivian Alvarez-Solon and the illegal detention of Cornelia Rao. And how did those things happen, where people in agencies knew that there was illegal action being taken against Australian citizens, yet we're not actually raising it? So we need to do everything we can to help agencies have a memory of what's gone wrong and focus on how they can improve things as they go forward. So shining a light as much as possible on the things that I'm concerned about, the views that I'm forming, the processes I'm using to form those views is really important for me in trying to help agencies to avoid maladministration and to properly deliver their functions. Thematic publications are another thing that we do as well, because if you publish a report about one agency, often other agencies won't pay attention to it because it's not about them. So we published last year a very short report called Room for Improvement, which said there are 5 themes we're seeing across the public sector generally that every agency needs to pay more attention to. The first one of those, a bit shockingly, is follow the law, because we see a lot of instances where agencies inadvertently are not correctly applying the laws that they're charged with administering. You might think to yourself, well, that's a fundamental piece of tradecraft, and AJ was talking about the fundamentals. So that's a really important thing for every agency and every public servant to start with. Do you understand the laws that you're actually administering? Are you administering them correctly? What would you do if you thought that you weren't administering them correctly? And the other 4 I'll rattle through quickly. Better record keeping. It's actually in the interests of agencies as well as in the interests of the community to have better records of decisions made. Train your staff better, because if you don't train your staff well, they're not going to be able to administer laws well. Communicate more clearly. So often we see that the issue is actually not the way in which the administration is being carried out, but an inability to explain what's happened to a member of the community. And finally, listen to complaints, because they're a free source of feedback about what you're doing and what you're not doing, about how you're making decisions, whether you're doing it well or not. So focusing on those things and focusing thematically is part of how we're trying to help agencies to get things right more. But then there's engagement with agencies at all levels, reaching out to CEOs, reaching out to different levels of staff, encouraging them to come forward as well. We've had post-Robodebt, I've seen a lot of serious reflection, as Paul said, and agencies coming forward and saying, we've identified a problem here and we're not quite sure what to do, what do we do? And so not punishing agencies for coming forward, helping them to think about, here's the thing, what are you going to do about it now? And I will say that with all that serious reflection, I still detect a reluctance to apologise. And I think that apologising when something's gone wrong is actually demonstrating accountability. And then remediation. What do you do to actually make it better? Because if you've had an instance of maladministration, it's impacted a member of the community, then something needs to be done to in fact put that right. And so encouraging agencies to take all those steps is what it's about.
And that's incredibly helpful, and it's made me want to pose the next question back to you again on that, because those 4 key priority areas would resonate incredibly with an audience of regulators. But importantly, regulators, as in those charged with upholding integrity in our government institutions, are now, as we move from the past to the current environment, really needing to apply data to inform their work programs. Could you share any insights with us about how you might be using data to identify trends and to move from an instance, albeit a really significant one, to inform your thematic approach?
Sure, and I have yet to meet a regulator who says that they have the resources that they would really like to be able to fully perform all their functions. And so data has got a really vital role to play in terms of helping you decide where you deploy your resources, what are the issues that are most important to address, and how will you address those issues, whether it's taking a regulatory action or a compliance type action, or whether it's taking an educative or a preventive mechanism. So, for example, one of my 17 different statutory functions is to administer the reportable conduct scheme in the ACT. A reportable conduct is about institutions that are responsible for children, people less than 18, and reporting and dealing appropriately with any allegations of potential abuse of those children. Now, we looked at the data we had of the reporting that was coming to us from institutions in the jurisdiction, and we thought about where were the weak spots, and we particularly were concerned about religious institutions and religious organisations in the ACT. So we followed that up with a specific survey to those institutions, and then we're building on that to take further outreach to those organisations and institutions, because the data was telling us not that there was necessarily abuse that was not being acted upon, but that those institutions weren't sufficiently aware of their obligations or of how the scheme worked. And so we tailored our action there to be an educative outreach prevention approach, whereas other times we take the data we have from complaints, we match that as much as we can with data that other regulators or other entities might have, and we say, is there something here that calls out for a detailed investigation? And so we might choose to do an own motion investigation and then publish a report on that. So it's a choice of the different levers that you have at your disposal, and how you deploy your resources and data is tremendously useful for that.
That's really helpful, particularly touching on the notion of collaboration with other actors in this environment. I'd like to turn to Paul, if I might, in terms of new ways of doing things in the Commission as a new and incredibly important institution upholding our integrity, how you might be applying technology and using data to inform your work program.
So we use environmental scanning, intelligence sharing and corruption referrals to monitor the integrity landscape. We're currently examining how we can accumulate data held by Commonwealth integrity agencies that have we're currently examining how data held by other Commonwealth agencies can be consolidated with ours, and we're including those with a whole of Commonwealth sector jurisdiction like the Ombudsman, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner and the APSC, to see if we can accumulate that data to identify, if you like, hotspots, and then in the longer term to identify trends. Most importantly, from our perspective, we've just completed administering the first Commonwealth Integrity Survey. This ran over a period of 5 weeks and was addressed to about 300,000 Commonwealth public officials. It's aimed to obtain feedback from them about their observations and perceptions of corruption and reporting behaviours and attitudes to reporting. We're just beginning to accumulate the results of that now, but what that will enable us to do once we have the results is to make general assessments about the risk of corruption, to identify potential corruption vulnerabilities, to identify hotspots, to improve the understanding of constituent parts of the Commonwealth public sector, and to identify issues, topics and themes that can inform corruption prevention and education initiatives. But we expect it will enable us in the first instance to identify high-risk areas, in the second to identify why people report and what stops them from reporting, and in the third, over a number of iterations of this survey, assuming we repeat it every couple of years, to identify trends. We also have a strategic intelligence and data analysis project that generates our jurisdictional risk assessment. This is a model for assessing relative corruption risks across the main agencies in the Commonwealth jurisdiction. The 2023 product utilised 7 measures from agency size, dispersal, reported code of conduct breaches, a total of 17 measures of that kind that, when amalgamated, provided a quantitative score and rating of relative corruption risk across the main departments and agencies in our jurisdiction. It provides a quantitative tool for measuring and assessing, if you like, relativities and high-risk areas. The final point I'd make is that I'll just move on to technology because that was part of the question as well. We use a range of technologies, including analytical data tools and visualizations, to inform and assist us complete our strategic assessments and in investigations. I'm not going to talk in any detail about some of the tools available to us for investigations. That said, in investigations, because of their inherently individual nature, a great deal of the collection and analysis still has to be performed manually. But our operation intel analysts have access to open source technology such as Fivecast that enables them to search and discover across a broad range of publicly and commercially available data services, to map digital footprints of persons of interest, to verify information, and to resolve identities. We continue to explore opportunities for greater use of technology, in particular to support our investigations.
That's a fascinating summary, thank you, and a very generous opportunity for this audience in particular to really consider what I think sounds like the high watermark in terms of technology and data application to drive programs of work. If I could turn to you, AJ, are there any international examples that you would be able to share with us today?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's really useful to think about sort of the big picture of how technology and the use of data has been transforming necessarily the way that regulators generally and integrity agencies in particular and integrity systems do their business. I think if there's one really big sort of success story about sort of the modern information age when it comes to integrity and accountability and regulation, it would be the transparency that technology, information technology and data brings. I mean, that also lifts public expectations, but it increases public accessibility to information about decision making. And I can think back to, when Transparency International Australia first recommended that political donations, for example, should be published in real time rather than after the event. And it's now well over a decade since the first jurisdiction, Queensland, introduced real-time disclosure of political donations. Very crucial to public integrity and to the context of regulatory practice, because it's all about transparency and who's pulling the strings or who might be pulling the strings and exercising influence over government. And now the Commonwealth is hopefully finally getting around to sort of catching up with that sort of principle. Internationally, we've seen transparent access and transparent publishing of data really transform the integrity landscape in so many places. In Ukraine, for example, Transparency International Ukraine actually developed and introduced the public transparent procurement contracting system there, e-procurement system, that then has also been adopted by a range of other countries that previously were very retrograde in their procurement system. So again, sort of things that we might take for granted in terms of transparency these days are not necessarily things that have been taken for granted elsewhere, and they have enormously revolutionising impacts on integrity. But I guess the interesting thinking about that in terms of where we stand, there's a couple of big challenges in our ability to use technology and data and also understand the context that we're operating in. I mean, one is the fact that almost any regulator, good regulator, knows that they need to be operating they need to make use of the data that is out there in order to understand their landscape. We're at a really interesting time here in Australia with the introduction of what's called Tranche 2 of our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws. This is a really significant moment because finally we're expanding the systems that rely on the use of big data beyond the core financial institutions to identify threats to the entire, well, to the country, as well as the complicity of Australian actors in corruption overseas. What's really interesting is we've got examples like in Austrac of the use of big data for a long time in very sophisticated ways, world-leading examples going back decades now. What's really interesting about the environment that integrity agencies and regulators live in now is that we live in a global environment more and more and more than ever before. So the big challenge is actually capability. The risks to our integrity systems, for example, are we might have really great data capabilities, but money is very easily laundered through Fiji or wherever where there are not those capabilities. And so it's a very interesting challenge, I think, for regulators as well as for Australian integrity agencies to be engaged in trying to, A, have enough capability, because very often government sort of assumes, well, you've got capability, you've got a big budget, you'll be able to update your IT systems and train all these new analysts at a pace that is actually not realistic without a lot of resources. But we've got even bigger capability problems in other countries with which we do business that we have to compensate for and think globally. So that's a really, really big challenge, I think, for all of us. The third thing I'd raise is AI. Just recognising that we're just at the beginning of starting to have to confront, okay, how do we harness AI, but also how do we ensure the accountable use of AI and have the capability to even identify how AI is really being used in whether in the market or necessarily by government. Some people think that Robodebt was about the use of AI and algorithms, and it wasn't really. It was much more basic than that, much more basic human breakdowns really, rather than AI going crazy. But just even the confusion over what the algorithm was and how it worked shows that when it comes to dealing with real AI, people are, we have a real challenge ahead of us to stay on top of that. So I think that we've got some enormous advantages, but I think the capability challenges, I think government really understanding the capability challenges of what our regulators, including our integrity agencies, really need to manage those agendas is one of our biggest challenges going forward, because I think, again, we sort of just tend to take it for granted. You've got lots of computers, got lots of smart people, figure it out. And it's much more complicated than that.
That answer really sets in place the sort of layers to build a pro-integrity culture. You've started off with talking about the approach that we need to have, about an ex-ante, a pro-integrity approach, and then you've talked about capability and considering capability both within Australia, within our own jurisdiction, but looking at the vulnerabilities internationally and how they might impact our ability to promote integrity. What I'd like each of you to consider and perhaps answer is what your view is as to how we might actually build the culture that sustains integrity and that actually adopts that pro-integrity approach. So if I could start perhaps with Paul on this occasion.
So I think there are three elements that I'd touch on, and some of them echo some themes that came out of what Iain said earlier, although they'll be in slightly different words. The first is that we need to build an understanding that legality is not optional. Iain put it as follow the law. But I think we need to get across the sector a understanding embedded that legality isn't optional, following the law is mandatory. Laws aren't obstacles to be evaded, they're not risks to be managed, and frankly in many areas there has been an approach that legal compliance is a risk to be managed rather than a question of comply. But they're norms that govern what we can lawfully do and what cannot be done. So that's the first thing I would suggest. The second is promote accountability. Ethical leadership involves being prepared to be accountable, not avoiding being held to account. But if we want people to be prepared to be accountable, they also need to understand that the consequence of being accountable is not that they're going to lose their heads or their jobs as an immediate result. The idea that there have to be heads on pikes for every error that is made is one that should have gone out centuries ago, and yet it is one that is very widely held today. If we maintain that sort of attitude, then we won't get accountability. If we have a more proportionate response, then that will promote accountability. And the third, which is obvious enough, is increase the risk of detection. And there are two ways that strike me of doing that. The first that we're looking at is introducing a monitoring and audit function so that we will be able to go to agencies and look at what they're doing, how they're dealing with integrity issues, what are the corruption risks in those agencies, and provide an opportunity for staff members to come forward to us in confidence with concerns. And the other side of that coin is promoting a reporting culture so that individuals are free and at liberty to report suspicions or observations of corrupt conduct. It's important that they know how to report and that they know what their protections are so that they can be comfortable in reporting. And that involves appropriate whistleblower protections. I think we've got very good ones in our legislation, the NAC Act. But it's also crucial that it be seen that when these people do the right thing and report misconduct, their careers don't perish but prosper.
Thank you. Iain, can I turn to you?
Sure. So, Liz, I think there are the whole of public sector steps. How do we train people, for example? What do we celebrate? What do we reward? What do we promote people for? Is it for delivery or is it for unsexy, slow assurance and actually finding out whether things have been right or not? I agree with Paul about it's not heads on spikes. Mistakes do happen, and almost every senior public servant has experience of things not going right. But it's what you then do, and how often do we in fact tell those stories and celebrate the fact that something was in fact recovered and remediated, as opposed to the simple the delivery. I mentioned before having corporate memories and picking up on the complying with the law not being optional. It's also not about outsourcing everything to lawyers either. Public servants have a duty to in fact make decisions and not to try to outsource their accountability to lawyers as part of minimising risk. It is about understanding the fundamental craft of being a good public servant. And then finally, of course, there's the role that regulators and integrity agencies have. We need to inhabit our own space fully. The Robodebt Royal Commission, which has been mentioned, was critical of the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman for not taking steps that we could have taken at the time. They may or may not have stopped Robodebt, but we chose not to take those steps. So it's really important that regulators be seen to be willing to use their powers, willing to act on issues. And so we also need to look at ourselves and say, have we properly trained our own staff? Do our staff understand that we will back them if they see an issue and raise an issue? Do our staff understand that we can make choices about using powers in particular contexts or not using powers, and that we are, in fact, actively making those choices? So that's a really important thing, our own capability that we can bring to help build a culture of compliance.
Just before I hand over to AJ for culture building observations, I would also make the observation that the Australian Information Commissioner featured in the Robodebt report as well, and we're starting an interesting discussion internally around what are the learnings of that and how can we create an environment in which we do examine that, test ourselves, look at a culture, and importantly, how we deliver on our integrity and other demands in terms of our regulatory responsibilities. Some of the interesting observations, particularly for regulators, that I would call out in relation to our chapter is really testing what we're told. by a respondent, and really challenging that against our framework, our legislative framework, our evidence matrix, and being ready to recalibrate. If you haven't quite got it right, what came in the door and how do you recalibrate your approach to be more responsive to that? I think that involves a degree of bravery, and when you have said to me previously, Iain, this notion that we need to occupy the space, for me, sitting behind occupying the space is knowing your space and being brave, knowing that the organisation is with you as you enter that space. And I think one of my observations, particularly in the landscape of information access as a fundamental tenet of ensuring that we have the evidence, the accountability that's required to propel forward an integrity culture, is recognising that for the most part, public servants will be protected when they act in good faith and when they lean into their requirements and that they act in a lawful manner. And I think that message is sometimes missing and needs to be repeated very frequently. So now if I might hear the views of an academic in terms of what builds an integrity culture.
Well, I'm glad you just added your own perspective and experience as Information Commissioner there, Liz, because I think part of what you were describing there in terms of the role of information in transparency is one of the key drivers for us bringing about real cultures of integrity, because that's the shop front, the gateway, if you like, to public accessibility, public understanding of what's going on, and the quid pro quo in that, the other side of that, is actually being integrity institutions or an integrity system or regulators who are really understanding and being responsive to what the community is seeing, feeling, wanting. It goes back to something I think Paul said right back at the beginning about there can be a mismatch between expectations and perceptions and the reality, but in democracies and in politics and in society, perception, becomes the reality. And so dealing with both legitimate and illegitimate community concerns, rising social expectations, rising fears and uncertainties is part of not just the business of government. Politicians are very used to this, but it's actually got to be the business of regulators in their specific fields, but particularly integrity agencies seeing how do we actually understand and manage public trust expectations. So the head-on pike version of accountability, I don't think it's as simple as saying people want heads on pikes, but they're not going to get them. They've got to grow up. I know that's not what you were saying, but it's more about, okay, how do we understand these demands for accountability, and then how do we actually respond to them? I think Iain, when you mentioned apologies, remediation, there are all sorts of ways of saying, yep, things did not go right here, and accountability can take many forms, but it's got to be delivered on if there's going to be public trust. So that's a huge learning curve that we're really still on in Australia. It's just been assumed that integrity agencies and the courts doing their job in isolation, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, we take it for granted. Everybody does their job, the system will work, everybody can be happy. It's not as simple as that. But I would say that understanding that need to be responsive and to what the community and stakeholders and allowing community and stakeholder participation in the settings and the management of how the system is working more than we're used to in Australia, I think is number one. Number two, I would wholeheartedly endorse what Paul said about a huge measure of whether the culture is right is whether people are speaking up or not about problems. It was really heartened to hear Iain say quite recently that the number of public servants who are coming to his office providing information about breakdowns within their agencies post-robo-debt has really changed quite radically from the days that I worked for the Ombudsman's office, and that's actually a good thing. That's actually a very good thing. But I think I think having the systems to sustain that, including effective whistleblower protections that actually work, because they may be great on paper, Paul, but they're not working very well in practice a lot of the time, quite famously in some instances. And so there's a real agenda there that needs to be met. All regulators need to be interested in the effectiveness of whistleblower protections, and also the simplicity. They need to be simple and consistent across different regimes. Otherwise, they just become another deterrent to people speaking up in and of themselves. But I suppose finally what I would say is that also endorsing some of the remarks about leadership, and going back to what I said at the beginning, I think we really need to use our interventions as people who are interested in integrity to support and remind and require and cajole and incentivise that integrity is not just about compliance. We've established how bad things can get when legality gets forgotten about or misunderstood. We've established that, but that integrity is fundamentally about so much more than compliance. It is about fairness. It is about honesty. It is about delivering good outcomes. It's about diligence, and it's about transparency. And hopefully legality is happening automatically. Hopefully we can take, although we know we can't, but we should be able to take legality for granted. So I think creating an environment where leadership, and I guess going right back to the beginning, this is where we live in a time where our political leaders are under more and more pressure than they've ever been before, and we really need to have strong integrity systems that support them to stay focused, as well as other senior public sector leaders, on what integrity really is and why it's there and what it's for, and not take it for granted.
That's a really comprehensive answer, but one that has provided a beautiful segue into questions from our hybrid audience today. And just to give you a break on the issue of whistleblowers, I might offer this question to the other panellists. And it's really taking us to the future. So I might deal with it in the discrete issue of whistleblower protections, and then ask you for your observations about what else could we do to promote integrity in this contemporary environment. So the question is, given the experience of whistleblowers under the public interest disclosure laws, what changes are necessary to encourage, manage, and, dare the person say it, and perhaps reward whistleblowers? I heard you mention the word reward. And that culture of disclosure, how do we promote it? So what else could we be doing? Iain?
So personally, and this is my personal opinion, I don't have a policy role, but I've always been very interested in the US approach with the False Claims Act, where whistleblowers can in fact be awarded a reward if they come forward and successfully identify fraud against the US government. And it actually tends to lead to the uncovering of significant white-collar crime much more simply, much earlier on. And when you actually burn your entire career by coming forward, you can be rewarded. Now, that's something that is a policy question for the Australian government as to would they want to go down that path. I think in Australia there's a reticence to the idea of rewarding someone who might, in fact, have had some involvement in the wrongdoing. But I do think that if you're a whistleblower, you are, in many cases, burning your career, and there needs to be recognition of that. But I also go with what Paul was saying earlier, that many people might be in a position of being encouraged to come forward and say something, and they shouldn't be punished. So you shouldn't have to, in fact, be burning your career to be raising questions. I will say that given my role in administering the Commonwealth Public Interest Disclosure Scheme, I think that it's still not very well understood by agencies. It's seen as being a very legalistic process, and it's not the best drafted piece of legislation. But agencies really should be stepping back. Instead of saying, do these allegations, these specific allegations stand up, they should actually be stepping back and saying, what if something was going on here? What are our checks and balances? And not simply worrying on proving or disproving the specific allegations. So I think that for an improved state of a whistleblowing regime at the Commonwealth level, it'd be really good if agencies would be more willing to actually engage with that question of what if and what are our safeguards, rather than saying, we've been told this, do we agree or not agree?
Right. Really interesting observation. Paul, any comments on the operation of the whistleblower protection legislation in practice or as described under a statute that is less than straightforward?
Well, our scheme is not entirely the same as the PID scheme. Referrals to us can also count as PID referrals and attract the protections under the PID legislation, but they have in their own right protections under our legislation, which are not quite so extensive as under the PID legislation because they don't extend to compensatory and injunctive remedies, which are available at least in some circumstances elsewhere. We made some submissions to the Attorney General Department review of the PID legislation, which is on foot at the moment, about that review, including the whistleblower legislation, and those submissions have been published. I've got to say I'm ambivalent about the idea of awards for whistleblowers. I don't have a strong view one way or the other on that. I'm yet to be persuaded that it's going to make a significant or have a significant beneficial effect, but it may. So, from my perspective, I think the jury is still out on that question.
Thank you. If I turn to what might be next for integrity in Australia, are there foundation pieces that are missing, or do we need to enhance our integrity systems and culture more? And if so, what would be your top one or two changes that you'd like to see implemented? Can I start with you, AJ?
Yeah, certainly. And just before we move off the whistleblowing front, just to round that off, I would just encourage anybody who wants to a diagnosis on what the current reform needs are, just go to the Transparency International Australia website, look up whistleblowing, and you'll find our roadmap on recommended reforms, particularly for the federal government level, which touch on many of these issues, but including in particular the need for effective enforcement capacity of protections to make them real, to actually embed them and follow through on them, which currently is the big missing link in most jurisdictions. But also very relevantly to regulators more generally, to think about whistleblower protections, not just in terms of the public sector being isolated from other sectors. The best whistleblowers for public sector integrity very often, especially corruption, come from the private sector. And currently we've got a very fragmented and incomplete whistleblower protection landscape right across the board. So what happens in terms of the reform of not just the public sector regime, but the Corporations Act whistleblower protection regimes, which are applying to companies, and other regimes, simplifying and unifying that whole landscape is actually really crucial. So do look up our roadmap for reform. And positively, there are many people in the federal government who are, including the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, who are working on major parts of this at the moment. But I think, and one thing we haven't really touched on directly, but I know is part of the conversation, is collaboration. I think that we're seeing more collaboration now between different integrity agencies that used to operate in silos. And obviously we've been big supporters of that and encouragers of that, for people to see this as an integrity system. And I think people working in a regulatory landscape would know, most regulatory environments would know that to be effective, you can't just treat yourself as if you're the only kid on the block, that in fact you will get your effectiveness by collaborating with other regulators, because the people who we're trying to regulate are only confused and more likely to do nothing if they're being hit by different regulation in isolation, in layers that aren't coordinated, and it doesn't all translate into, well, how do I actually embed this in my business? And same with public sector leadership. There are government agencies all over the place where you can find the policies for this, that, and the other, all different parts of integrity, all built up on one another, like in an archaeological dig. with none of them being effectively implemented unless they're actually integrated into a whole. So I think there's more and more scope for collaboration, as well as more and more scope for collaboration between civil society and stakeholders, those in the regulators who are actually engaging in best practice, the leading lights, actually engaging them into the community of practice, literally with integrity agencies and regulators, but especially civil society, so that we can help keep all the bastards honest. And I think we really have to strengthen up that collaboration if we're going to stay ahead of the game.
So more collaboration makes it a more robust system. I am conscious of time, but I would really value comments from Paul and from Iain just on if there was one additional thing we should be doing, what might that be?
Don't know that I put my hand on one additional thing, but I think the key answer lies in the area of culture rather than institutions and policies. Culture's the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of humans, transmitted from one generation to another. Culture establishes the accepted bounds and decision points for behaviour. Culture provides the organisational norms and boundaries for value-based decisions. Culture is basically what people do rather than what policies might tell them to do. And I think the key feature in building a pro-integrity environment is that cultural aspect, rather than further institutions and policies, and embedding a pro-integrity culture is the key thing I'd put my finger on.
Thank you, Paul. Before I turn to Iain, I just want to acknowledge the questions or observations coming in online, and I think that answer really addressed a number of them, because there are questions here about how do we have public confidence when we see corruption issues play out in the way that they have in the past, particularly in terms of representative leaders, for example, elected leaders. And I think you've touched on something around the culture that also goes to the public interest. And that's a dynamic test. And being responsive to the public interest and adjusting your culture to ensure that we are representative, that we do reflect the public interest in a pro-integrity culture is a really important addition to this discussion. Iain, you have the closing comments.
Liz, I'll try not to abuse that privilege. So, look, huge believer in collaboration. Really important that we do, in fact, share what we know, that we make our decisions independently, but don't actually operate as though we're all alone and there's no one else around. We can avoid duplication, but we can also amplify each other's messages, and that can be really important. We did an exercise recently where we looked at MyGov and fraud risks in MyGov in terms of people's accounts being taken over. That followed on from the Auditor General looking at some specific aspects of MyGov and the Inspector General of Taxation looking at the ATO's part of MyGov and GST fraud, but neither of them had looked at the ease with which accounts can be taken over on MyGov, which seemed to be a glaring problem that we shone a light on, but we didn't look at other issues because they'd already been taken care of. So that, for us, was about not duplicating but amplifying something of concern. Absolutely endorse Paul's comments about the vital importance of culture. The one thing, it's that integrity be understood as not being something you can tick a box on. That integrity does require, I guess, a bit like the RSL might say, the price of integrity is eternal vigilance. We actually need to keep thinking about integrity as something that we'll only have if we keep, in fact, treasuring it, celebrating it, rewarding it, etc.
What a great note to conclude this discussion on, which could go on for a lot longer, but given the constraints of time and in respect of our online audience who have been with us for the last hour, thank you all very much. I'm now bringing the session to a close. For all of those online, we will remain in session just for a few moments because we need to acknowledge and reward those people who have attended today and been such a great in-person audience. So thank you to our online attendees.